Working as a salesperson in a jewelry store, the woman froze upon realizing that the millionaire client was her husband who passed away 8 years ago. The soft chime of the store's front doorbell echoed through the air as Emily adjusted the bracelet display in the sparkling glass case. The jewelry store, nestled in the heart of bustling New York City, hummed with quiet sophistication. The delicate lighting reflected off diamonds, emeralds, and sapphires. Bathing the room in a warm, golden glow, Emily glanced at her reflection in the glass, her tired hazel eyes meeting her own. She adjusted a stray lock of her auburn hair and sighed. 8 years. That's how long it had been since her world crumbled. Losing Michael in that horrific car accident felt like someone had ripped her heart out and left her to figure out how to keep breathing. But she had. She'd done it for her son, Ethan, who was only 2 when it happened. Now 10 years old. He was her anchor, her light on even the darkest days. "Mom, you're staring off into space again." Ethan had teased her that morning as he packed his school bag. His playful tone and wide grin had pulled her out of her reverie. He had Michael's smile, crooked but undeniably charming, and every time she saw it, her heart ached and healed at the same time. Shaking off the memory, Emily returned her focus to work. It had taken years to get here, to this sense of normalcy. The job at the jewelry store was her second chance. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and it gave her purpose. Over time, she'd earned the trust of her boss, Mr. Whitaker, and the loyal clientele who frequented the shop. Emily had a knack for connecting with people, understanding what they wanted even before they spoke. "Emily, can you help Mrs. Carlton with her order?" Susan, her colleague, called from across the room. Emily nodded and approached the older woman who had been a regular for years. Mrs. Carlton's eyes lit up when she saw Emily, and the two exchanged warm greetings before diving into the details of a custom bracelet order. For a moment, the world outside the shop didn't exist. Emily was in her element, focused and confident, but as the day wore on and the crowds thinned, a familiar wave of melancholy settled over her. It always did during the quieter moments. She'd learned to live with it, that dull ache of missing Michael, the questions that would never be answered. What if he had survived? What if things had been different? "Hey, you okay?" Susan asked softly as they both closed up for the day. Emily forced a smile. "Yeah, just tired, long day." Susan gave her a knowing look but didn't push. Everyone knew Emily carried a weight she rarely spoke about. The subway ride home was uneventful. As usual, Emily leaned her head against the window, watching the city blur past. She thought about Ethan, probably engrossed in his homework or one of his video games. He was her motivation for everything, the reason she kept going when it felt impossible. When she finally stepped into her small apartment, Ethan greeted her with a warm hug. "Pizza for dinner?" he asked, his face lighting up with hope. Emily laughed. "Again, you'll turn into a slice of pizza at this rate." "Better than broccoli," he retorted, grinning as they ate and talked about his day at school. Emily felt a fleeting moment of peace. Life wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. She had built something out of the ashes, and that was enough. For now, later that night, as she tucked Ethan into bed, he looked up at her with those big, curious eyes. "Mom, do you think Dad would be proud of me?" The question hit her like a punch to the chest. She swallowed hard, blinking back the sudden sting of tears. "Of course he would," she whispered, stroking his hair. "He'd be so proud of you, Ethan. You're everything he dreamed of and more." Ethan smiled, satisfied with her answer, and closed his eyes. Emily lingered for a moment, watching him sleep. Before retreating to her room, she sat on the edge of her bed, holding a small locket that had been Michael's last gift to her. Inside was a picture of the 3 of them from Ethan's first birthday. She traced the edges of the photo with her thumb, her mind drifting to a life that felt like a dream now. As she lay down, staring at the ceiling, Emily tried to push away the familiar ache in her chest. Tomorrow was a new day, another chance to keep going. She didn't know that her carefully rebuilt world was about to be turned upside down, and when it did, nothing would ever be the same again. The morning sun streamed through the glass windows of the jewelry store. Bathing the showroom in a soft golden hue, Emily stood behind the counter, carefully arranging a new collection of diamond necklaces. Her movements were precise, almost meditative, as she focused on making each piece sparkle under the perfect angle of light. It was her way of calming her restless mind. Routine and order gave her a sense of control. Even on the days when her thoughts felt like a storm, the store buzzed with the soft hum of chatter. Customers browsed the displays, and the occasional laughter of colleagues echoed in the air. It was a normal day, or so it seemed. "Emily, can you handle the front while I take inventory in the back?" Susan asked, holding a clipboard. "Of course," Emily replied, brushing her hands against her apron. She stepped forward to greet a young couple who had just walked in, helping them select an engagement ring. Moments like these, filled with hope and love, always made her smile, even if they brought a faint pang of nostalgia. As the couple left, the bell above the door chimed again. Emily looked up, her practiced smile already in place, but the moment her eyes met the man who entered, her breath caught in her throat. He walked in with an air of quiet confidence, his tailored gray suit fitting him perfectly. His dark hair was neatly combed, and his piercing blue eyes scanned the room briefly before landing on her. For a second, she froze, unable to look away. His face, sharp jawline, the curve of his lips, the intensity in his gaze, was one she knew all too well. It was a face she had memorized in countless sleepless nights and framed in her heart for 8 long years. Michael. Her legs felt unsteady as he approached the counter, but before she could utter a word, he spoke, and his voice sent a shiver down her spine. It was the same voice she had heard whispering promises in dreams years ago. "Good afternoon," he said politely, his tone calm but authoritative. "I'm looking for a gift, something elegant but not overstated." Emily blinked, her mind racing. Was she hallucinating? Was this some cruel trick of her imagination? Or could it really be him? "Of course," she managed to say, her voice trembling slightly. "Do you have anything specific in mind?" He smiled, a small, polite smile that was nothing like the warm, familiar grin she remembered. "Not really. Perhaps you could help me choose." Emily nodded mechanically, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned to the display case, pulling out a tray of elegant bracelets. "These are some of our most popular pieces," she said, keeping her tone professional despite the turmoil inside her. As he examined the jewelry, she stole glances at him, searching for answers in his face. Everything about him, his mannerisms, the way he tilted his head when he was thinking, the faint scar near his temple, was exactly like Michael. And yet, his demeanor was different. There was a distance in his eyes, a sense of detachment that she didn't recognize. "I like this one," he said, pointing to a delicate gold bracelet with small diamond accents. "It's simple but beautiful." "It's a lovely choice," Emily replied, her voice steadying as she slipped back into her role. "Would you like it gift-wrapped?" "Yes, please," he said, handing her his credit card. She took it, her fingers brushing against his hand for the briefest moment. The touch sent a jolt through her, a rush of memories flooding back. Holding hands during late-night walks, the warmth of his embrace, the feel of his fingers intertwined with hers. As she wrapped the bracelet, she stole another glance at the name on the card. James Carter, not Michael. Her heart sank, confusion and disbelief swirling in her mind. Could she have been wrong? Was this man just a stranger who happened to look and sound exactly like her late husband? She handed him the wrapped box and his receipt, forcing a smile. "Here you go, Mr. Carter. I hope the recipient loves it." "Thank you," he said, his gaze lingering on her for a moment. "You've been very helpful." As he turned to leave, Emily felt a surge of desperation. She couldn't let him walk out of her life, not without answers. "Mr. Carter?" she called, her voice breaking slightly. He stopped and turned back to her, a hint of curiosity in his eyes. "Yes, She hesitated, struggling to find the right words. "I just wanted to say, you look familiar. Have we met before?" He frowned slightly, tilting his head as if trying to recall. "I don't believe so. I'm not from around here." "Oh," she said, her heart sinking further. "I must be mistaken. My apologies." "No need to apologize," he said with a polite smile. "Have a good day." And with that, he walked out, leaving Emily standing behind the counter, her thoughts a chaotic mess. She stared at the door long after it closed, her mind replaying every detail of their interaction. It couldn't have been a coincidence. It had to be him, But if it was, why didn't he recognize her? Why was he living under a different name? Her hands trembled as she picked up the receipt he had signed. She traced the name James Carter with her finger. Her mind made up. She wasn't going to let this go. She needed answers, and she was determined to get them. Emily couldn't sleep that night. She tossed and turned, her mind replaying every second of her encounter with James Carter. The way he walked, the subtle cadence of his voice, and that faint scar on his temple. It all screamed Michael. But how could it be? Michael was gone. She'd buried him. She'd mourned him. She'd built a life around the void his absence had left. And yet, there he was, standing in front of her like a ghost who had stepped out of her memories, unable to bear the swirling thoughts. Emily got out of bed and tiptoed to the living room. Ethan was fast asleep, his soft breathing a soothing reminder of the one stable thing in her life. She sat down on the couch and opened her laptop, her fingers trembling slightly as she typed James Carter Chicago into the search bar. The results came quickly. Articles about a successful entrepreneur in Chicago's real estate market, complete with polished photos of James Carter at charity galas and business events. He looked refined, confident, every bit the man who had walked into her store earlier that day. Emily stared at the photos, her heart pounding. It wasn't just the physical resemblance. It was the way he held himself, the faint glint of humor in his eyes, things only someone who had loved Michael deeply would notice. Her eyes landed on a headline from a local Chicago paper, James Carter, a self-made success story. Clicking on it, she scanned the article. It detailed how James had moved to Chicago roughly 8 years ago, starting from nothing before building his empire. 8 years. The timing matched, but there was no mention of his life before Chicago, no personal details about family or past relationships. It was as if James Carter hadn't existed before that. Emily leaned back, running a hand through her hair. It was too much of a coincidence. She wasn't imagining this. It had to be him, but how? And why didn't he recognize her? The questions burned in her chest, demanding answers. The next day at work, Emily was distracted. Her usual focus and precision wavered, and even Susan noticed. "Everything okay?" Susan asked, setting down a tray of necklaces she'd been organizing. "You've been off all morning." "I'm fine," Emily lied, forcing a smile. "Just didn't sleep well." Susan didn't look convinced, but didn't press further. Emily appreciated that. She wasn't ready to talk about this, not until she knew for sure what she was dealing with. Midway through her shift, the bell above the door chimed, and Emily's heart leapt into her throat. For a brief, irrational moment, she thought James had come back, but it was just a delivery man with a package. Emily sighed, disappointment mingling with relief. What was she even hoping for? That he'd walk back in, look at her, and suddenly remember everything. Her thoughts were interrupted when Mr. Whitaker, the store's owner, called her into his office. "Emily, do you have a minute?" "Of course," she said, following him. Inside, Mr. Whitaker handed her a card. "A client was very impressed with your service yesterday. He left this for you." Emily's heart raced as she took the card. It was simple, with elegant black lettering. James Carter. Below his name was a phone number and an address in Chicago. She stared at it, her mind spinning. Why would he leave this for her? Was it just a polite gesture? Or did he feel something too? "Thank you," she murmured, tucking the card into her pocket. When her shift ended, Emily walked out into the crisp evening air, clutching her phone tightly. She'd been staring at James's number all afternoon, debating whether to call. What would she even say? "Hi, you look like my dead husband. Can we talk?" The thought made her cringe, but she couldn't let it go. Taking a deep breath, she dialed the number. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "This is James Carter." Emily froze, her heart hammering in her chest. For a moment, she couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the flood of emotions his voice triggered. "Hello?" he said again, a hint of impatience creeping into his tone. "Hi," she finally managed, her voice trembling. "This is Emily, from the joalery store." "Emily," he said, his tone softening. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you. I hope it's not a bad time," she said quickly. Well, you left your card, and I wanted to thank you." "It's no trouble at all," he replied. "You were very helpful yesterday." There was a pause, heavy with unspoken words. Emily wanted to ask him a million questions, but she didn't know where to start. "Actually," James said, breaking the silence, "I'm glad you called. There's something about you. I don't know how to explain it, but you seem familiar." Emily's breath caught. "I was thinking the same thing." Another pause. Then James spoke, his voice tinged with curiosity. "I'm in New York for a few more days. Would you like to meet for coffee? I feel like there's more to this." Emily hesitated, her mind screaming both yes and no, but the pull was too strong to ignore. "I'd like that," she said softly. "Great," he said, his voice warm. "How about tomorrow afternoon?" "Tomorrow works," Emily replied, her heart racing. They exchanged details, and when the call ended, she sat on the edge of her bed, clutching the phone like a lifeline. Tomorrow, she might finally get the answers she'd been searching for. But something told her that whatever she found out, her life would never be the same again. The following afternoon, Emily sat at a small corner table in a quiet cafe in Midtown, her fingers wrapped tightly around a steaming cup of tea. She had arrived 20 minutes early, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. What would she say? How could she even begin to explain the storm brewing inside her? A part of her wanted answers, but another part was terrified of what she might discover. If James Carter truly was Michael, what could possibly explain the 8-year gap? The bell above the cafe door jingled, and Emily's head shot up. Her breath caught as James stepped inside, scanning the room until his eyes landed on her. He smiled, a polite, reserved smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and walked toward her table. She watched him approach, her heart pounding as if she were seeing a ghost. "Emily," he said, pulling out the chair across from her. "Thanks for meeting me." "Of course," she replied, trying to steady her voice. "I appreciate you taking the time." James gestured toward the barista, ordering a coffee before turning his full attention to her. Up close, the resemblance was even more striking. His eyes, his mannerisms, the way he tilted his head slightly when he was listening. It was all Michael. But his posture, his tone, the way he carried himself, they felt foreign, like someone wearing a familiar mask. "I have to admit," James began, his voice smooth but tinged with curiosity, "I wasn't sure if you'd call, but there's something about you that feels, I don't know, familiar. Does that make sense?" Emily's heart skipped a beat. "It does," she said carefully, choosing her words. "I felt the same way when I saw you in the store. It's strange, isn't it?" He nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he were trying to solve a puzzle. "It is. I keep feeling like we've met before, but I can't place it, and trust me, I'm usually good with faces." Emily forced a small laugh, though inside, she was anything but calm. "Well, New York can feel like a small world sometimes." The barista arrived with James's coffee, momentarily breaking the tension. Emily took the opportunity to gather her thoughts. Should she tell him the truth now? That she thought he was her husband, presumed dead for nearly a decade? Or should she wait? Try to learn more about him first. James took a sip of his coffee, his gaze never leaving hers. "So, tell me about yourself, Emily. How long have you been working at the jewelry store?" "Almost 6 years now," she replied. "It's not what I planned for my life, but it's been good to me. I've met a lot of interesting people there. Interesting enough to call one of them," he teased lightly, his tone warm. Emily smiled, though her nerves were still on edge. "Maybe. What about you? What brought you to New York?" "Business," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I'm in real estate, mostly in Chicago, but I have a few projects here I'm overseeing." "Chicago," Emily repeated, her voice soft. "Have you always lived there?" James hesitated for a fraction of a second before shaking his head. "No, I moved there about 8 years ago. Before that." He paused, his brow furrowing slightly. "Well, honestly, it's a bit of a blur. I had an accident, and my memory from before that time isn't very clear." Emily's heart stopped. 8 years ago. An accident. Her fingers tightened around her cup as she tried to process what he had just said. "An accident," she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," James said, his expression unreadable. "It was a car accident. Pretty bad, apparently. I don't remember much about it, but I was told I was lucky to survive." Her mind raced. The timing, the the circumstances, it all aligned too perfectly. This couldn't be a coincidence. "I'm sorry to hear that," she said, keeping her tone neutral despite the storm inside her. "It must have been difficult." "It was," he admitted, his voice softer now. "But I had a lot of help. A family in Chicago took me in, helped me get back on my feet. I owe them a lot." Emily nodded slowly, her thoughts a chaotic mess. A part of her wanted to reach across the table to grab his hands and tell him everything, but she couldn't. Not yet. "Do you ever feel like you're missing something?" she asked carefully. "Like, there's a part of your life that doesn't quite fit?" James tilted his head, considering her question. "Sometimes," he said after a moment, "I get these flashes, images, feelings, like déjà vu, but stronger. It's frustrating because I can never pin them down." Emily's chest tightened. "Maybe it's just a matter of time," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Sometimes things come back when we least expect them." James studied her, his gaze piercing. "You're very insightful, Emily. I feel like you understand more about me than I do." She forced a small smile, her heart aching. "Maybe I just have a good sense for people." As their conversation continued, Emily found herself walking a tightrope, desperate for answers but afraid of pushing too hard. When they finally parted ways, James gave her a small, lingering smile that left her both hopeful and heartbroken. "Thanks again for meeting me," he said. "I hope we can do this again sometime." "Me too," she replied, her voice barely steady as she watched him walk away. Emily knew one thing for certain. She couldn't let this go. She had to uncover the truth, no matter where it led. But she also knew that the road ahead would be anything but easy. Emily's mind raced as she made her way home from the cafe. Every word James had said replayed in her head. The accident, the amnesia, the family who had helped him start over. She gripped the subway pole tightly, her knuckles white. The pieces fit too well to be coincidence, but she still couldn't wrap her mind around it. How could Michael, her Michael, be alive and sitting across from her as if he were someone else entirely? And if he truly didn't remember her, what had happened to him after the accident? The apartment felt unusually quiet when she walked in. Ethan was at a friend's house, and the silence only amplified the noise in her head. She set her bag down and paced the small living room, running her hands through her hair. She needed more information. She needed to know the truth. Grabbing her laptop, she settled onto the couch and began digging deeper into James Carter's life. She combed through every article she could find, piecing together his rise in Chicago's real estate scene. His name had started appearing in business circles 8 years ago. Right after Michael's accident, there were mentions of his philanthropy, his charm, his business acumen, but nothing personal. No mention of family, no past connections, no hints of who he had been before Chicago. Her stomach churned as she clicked on a photo from a charity gala. James stood next to an older couple, their smiles beaming with pride. The caption identified them as William and Diane Carter, prominent Chicago philanthropists. Were they the family who had taken him in? Did they know who he truly was? Did he? The questions kept piling up, and Emily knew she couldn't sit idle any longer. She needed someone who could help her piece together the missing parts of the puzzle. There was only one person who came to mind: Lila Thompson. Her best friend from college and a journalist with a knack for uncovering the truth. The next morning, Emily called Lila, her fingers trembling as she dialed the number. "Emily," Lila's cheerful voice answered after the second ring. "It's been forever, how are you?" "I'm complicated," Emily admitted. "Emily," her voice shaky. "Lila, I need your help. It's important." The tone of Lila's voice shifted immediately. "What's going on? Are you okay?" Emily hesitated, unsure of how much to say over the phone. "It's a long story. Can we meet? I'll explain everything." "Of course," Lila said without hesitation. "When and where?" "Today, if you're free, I'll come to you." By the time Emily arrived at the cafe where they'd agreed to meet, her nerves were shot. Lila was already seated, her signature oversized sunglasses perched on her head. She stood to hug Emily, her warm, familiar presence a small comfort. "Okay," Lila said as they sat down. "You look like you've seen a ghost. Start talking." Emily took a deep breath and launched into the story, starting with James Carter's visit to the store and ending with their conversation at the cafe. Lila listened intently, her brow furrowed as Emily described the uncanny resemblance, the accident, and the amnesia. When Emily finished, Lila leaned back in her chair, her expression a mix of disbelief and intrigue. "So, you think James Carter is Michael? You're Michael?" Emily nodded. "I know it sounds insane, but everything matches. The timeline, the accident, the way he looks, the way he acts. It's him." "Lila, I know it is." Lila tapped her fingers against the table, her journalist instincts clearly kicking in. "If this is true, it's huge. But we need proof. You said he mentioned a family in Chicago. William and Diane Carter, right? If they're the ones who helped him, they might know more." Emily's stomach twisted. What if they knew he had a life before Chicago and kept it from him? What if they lied to him? "Then we'll find out," Lila said firmly. "But first, let's see if there's anything public about them that might give us a lead." They spent the next hour poring over articles, photos, and interviews with the Carters. It didn't take long to confirm that William and Diane were major players in Chicago's social scene. Known for their wealth and generosity, they had no children of their own, which made it plausible that they had adopted James, whether officially or unofficially. But why would they help him build a new identity? Emily wondered aloud. It doesn't make sense. Maybe they didn't know who he was, Lila suggested. If he had amnesia, they might have just seen someone who needed help and decided to step in. Or they did know, Emily finished, her voice heavy. And they kept it from him on purpose. Lila sighed, closing her laptop. There's only one way to find out. You need to dig deeper. Talk to him again. Get him to open up. Emily nodded, though the thought of confronting James again filled her with both hope and dread. "I will. But, Lila, if this is Michael, and he doesn't remember me, what happens then? What if he never remembers?" Lila reached across the table, squeezing Emily's hand. "Then you decide if you can live with who he is now, not who he was. But don't jump ahead, okay? Let's focus on getting answers first." As Emily walked home, her mind churned with possibilities. She couldn't let fear hold her back. Michael, or James, was out there, and she was closer than ever to uncovering the truth. But as determined as she was, a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that this journey would reveal more than she was ready to face. The afternoon sun cast long shadows on the sidewalk as Emily made her way to the library, a place she hadn't visited in years but now felt compelled to go after her conversation with Lila. She knew she couldn't wait for answers to fall into her lap. If James truly was Michael, there had to be a trail, something in the official records that could connect the dots between his accident and his new life in Chicago. She felt a mixture of hope and dread as she crossed the threshold of the library, its familiar scent of aged books and polished wood oddly comforting. The librarian, an older woman with wire-rimmed glasses, greeted her with a warm smile. "How can I help you today?" Emily hesitated. What was she even looking for? Police reports, news articles, anything that could confirm what James had told her about the accident. "I'm looking for information on a car accident that happened about 8 years ago. Do you have access to archives for local newspapers?" The librarian nodded, gesturing toward the computer terminals. "We do. The newspaper archives go back decades. You can use the search feature to narrow it down by date and keywords." "Thank you," Emily said. Making her way to the nearest terminal, she logged in and began typing. Car accident. New York, 8 years ago. Hundreds of results popped up, but most were irrelevant. She added more keywords. Fatal accident. Unidentified victim. Amnesia. The list narrowed, and her heart leapt when she saw a headline. Mysterious accident leaves man in critical condition. Victim unidentified. She clicked on it, her hands trembling. The article was brief, but it described a single car crash on a rainy night in upstate New York. The driver, a man in his early 30s, had been found unconscious at the scene with no identification. The car was registered to a rental agency, and authorities believed he had been traveling alone. The report ended by stating that the man had been airlifted to a hospital in critical condition, but had survived. Emily's pulse quickened as she scrolled further. The article mentioned the date of the accident, exactly 1 week after Michael's supposed death. It also included the name of the hospital where the victim had been treated, St. Andrew's Medical Center. Grabbing her phone, Emily quickly searched for the hospital. It was still operational, located about an hour outside the city. Her stomach twisted at the thought of what she might uncover there. But she knew she had no choice. If this was her only lead, she had to follow it. The next morning, Emily dropped Ethan off at school and made the drive to St. Andrews. The hospital loomed large and imposing as she pulled into the parking lot, its stark white exterior gleaming under the morning sun. Her heart pounded as she approached the reception desk, unsure of what to say. "Hi," she began, her voice wavering slightly. "I'm looking for information about a patient who was treated here about 8 years ago. He was involved in a car accident." The receptionist, a young woman with a kind smile, looked up from her computer. "Do you know the patient's name?" Emily hesitated. "I believe he might have been admitted as a John Doe. I don't have a name, but it was a single car accident, and he was airlifted here." The woman frowned, typing into her computer. "We don't usually release patient information without authorization, but I can check if there's a record matching your description." "Thank you," Emily said, clutching her bag tightly. After a few moments, the receptionist nodded. "We did have a John Doe admitted around that time. He was in critical condition and treated here for several weeks before being transferred." "Transferred?" Emily asked, her heart sinking. "Yes, to a private care facility in Chicago. The family who took responsibility for him made the arrangements." Emily's chest tightened. It all lined up. The accident, the transfer to Chicago, the family who had helped him. It was all connected. She fought to keep her composure as she pressed further. "Do you have the name of the facility?" The receptionist hesitated. "I'm sorry, I can't give out that information. It's confidential." "Please," Emily pleaded, her voice trembling. "This is incredibly important. I think this man might be my husband." The woman's expression softened, but she shook her head apologetically. "I'm really sorry. I can't release that without proper authorization." Emily felt a wave of frustration and helplessness. She thanked the receptionist and left, her mind racing. She couldn't give up now, not when she was so close. There had to be another way to get the information she needed. As she sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel tightly, her phone buzzed. It was Lila. "Hey," Lila said, when Emily answered. "Any luck?" "I found out he was transferred to a private care facility in Chicago," Emily said, her voice heavy with emotion. "But they wouldn't tell me where." Lila was silent for a moment. "Leave it to me. I'll see what I can dig up. If this place exists, I'll find it." Emily exhaled, relief washing over her. "Thank you, Lila. I don't know what I'd do without you. You'd probably still be pacing your living room." Lila teased lightly. "Hang tight. I'll call you as soon as I have something." As Emily ended the call, she stared out at the hospital, her mind a tangle of emotions. She was closer than ever to uncovering the truth, but with every step forward, the weight of what she might find grew heavier. If this really was Michael, why had no one told her he'd survived? And why had he been sent so far away? One thing was certain. The answers wouldn't come easily, but Emily was ready to face whatever lay ahead. The next few days passed in a blur of restless nights and anxious thoughts. Emily was constantly on edge, her mind replaying the events at St. Andrews Hospital and the details she had uncovered. Lila had promised to dig deeper into the private facility in Chicago, but every hour of silence felt like an eternity. Emily threw herself into her work at the joalery store, trying to distract herself, but even the familiar routine couldn't quiet the questions swirling in her mind. On a quiet afternoon, as Emily adjusted a display of engagement rings, the chime of the store's front door caught her attention. She looked up, her breath hitching as James Carter stepped inside. He was wearing a navy blazer and dark slacks, his confident stride drawing the attention of everyone in the room. For a moment, Emily froze, unsure of what to do. She hadn't expected to see him again so soon. "Emily," he said warmly as he approached the counter. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "No, not at all," she replied, her voice steady despite the quickening pace of her heart. "How can I help you today?" James smiled, leaning casually against the counter. "I was hoping you could help me choose another piece. The bracelet I bought last time was very well received, and I thought I'd come back for your expertise." Emily nodded, keeping her professional demeanor intact, even as her thoughts raced. "Of course, any particular occasion." "Not really," he said, his gaze lingering on her. "I just thought it would be nice to have something new." She pulled out a tray of necklaces, her hands steady despite the emotions bubbling beneath the surface. "These are some of our newest designs. Let me know if anything catches your eye." James studied the necklaces, but his focus seemed to drift back to Emily. "You seem different today," he said after a moment. "Distracted, maybe?" Emily forced a smile. "Just a busy week." He said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I feel like there's more to it than that." She hesitated, unsure of how to respond. Before she could say anything, James gestured to a delicate gold pendant with a small sapphire in the center. "This one is beautiful, simple, but elegant. It's a great choice," Emily said, carefully removing the necklace from the tray. "Would you like it gift-wrapped?" "Yes, please," he said, watching her closely as she began to wrap the necklace in the store's signature packaging. As she worked, James spoke again, his tone softer. "I've been thinking about our conversation the other day, about how we both felt familiar to each other." Emily's hands faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly. "What about it?" "It's strange, isn't it?" he said, leaning slightly closer. "I can't shake the feeling that I know you from somewhere, but I've gone over everything in my mind, and I just can't place it." Emily set the wrapped box on the counter, meeting his gaze. "Maybe it's just one of those things. People say everyone has a double somewhere in the world." James chuckled, though his expression remained thoughtful. "Maybe, but it feels like more than that." She hesitated, debating whether to say what was on her mind before she could decide. James continued, "You know, I've been having these flashes lately, little snippets of something that feels like a memory, but it's all so unclear. It's frustrating, really." "What kind of flashes?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James shrugged, his brow furrowing. "Places, faces, moments, nothing concrete, but enough to make me wonder. It started after our conversation at the cafe. Something about you? It triggered something, I think." Emily's heart pounded. "Do you remember anything specific?" "No," he admitted, shaking his head. "Just feelings, mostly, like I'm missing something important." Emily wanted to say so much, to tell him everything, but she couldn't. Not yet. Instead, she said carefully, "Maybe those flashes will become clearer with time." "Maybe," he said, studying her intently. "Or maybe I just need to dig deeper." The sound of the door chime broke the moment, and Emily turned to see a new customer entering the store. She glanced back at James, who gave her a small, apologetic smile. "I should let you get back to work," he said, picking up the wrapped box. "But thank you, Emily, for the help. And the conversation. Anytime," she replied, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. As he left, Emily stood behind the counter, her hands gripping the edge as she tried to steady herself. Every interaction with James only deepened her certainty that he was Michael, but his flashes of memory gave her a glimmer of hope. Maybe he wasn't entirely lost. Maybe with time he would remember. That evening, Emily called Lila to update her on the encounter. "He's starting to have flashes of memory," she said, pacing her living room. "He doesn't know what they mean yet, but it's something. That's a good sign," Lila said. "It means part of him is still connected to who he was." "But what if it's not enough?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "What if he never remembers me or Ethan?" Lila's tone was firm. "Then you'll have to decide what you're willing to fight for. But for now, focus on what you can do. I'm still working on the Chicago angle. If the family he mentioned really took him in, they might have more answers." Emily nodded, though Lila couldn't see her. "Thank you, Lila. I don't know what I'd do without you. You'd figure it out," Lila said with a small laugh. "You're stronger than you think." As Emily hung up, she sat on the edge of her bed, clutching the locket Michael had given her years ago. She traced the edges with her fingers, her mind swirling with hope and fear. No matter how daunting the path ahead seemed, she couldn't give up. She was closer than ever to the truth, and to the man she had never stopped loving. The night felt endless as Emily lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Sleep wouldn't come, no matter how much she tried to quiet her thoughts. The flashes James had mentioned replayed in her mind. What if they were fragments of the life they had built together? Memories of their small apartment, late-night talks, and the way he always kissed her forehead before leaving for work. It gave her hope, but it also terrified her. What if those flashes were all he could remember? What if the rest of his past, their love, their family, was lost forever? When morning came, Emily was already up, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee at the kitchen table. Ethan shuffled into the room, his hair sticking out in every direction. "Morning, Mom," he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. "Morning, kiddo," Emily said, forcing a smile. "Cereal's on the counter." Ethan grabbed a bowl and sat across from her, munching sleepily as she watched him. He was growing so fast, and every day he looked more like Michael. The thought made her heart ache. What would happen if James, remembered everything? Would he want to be part of their lives again? And how would Ethan react to meeting the father he thought he'd lost? Her phone buzzed on the table, jolting her from her thoughts. It was Lila. "I've got something," Lila said without preamble. "The private care facility James was transferred to. It's called Crestwood Recovery Center. It's in Chicago. And guess who paid the bills?" "William and Diane Carter," Emily guessed, her grip tightening on the phone. "Bingo," Lila confirmed. They covered everything, from his medical expenses to his therapy sessions. I dug a little deeper and found some local news coverage from the time, apparently, the Carters introduced him as their nephew when he started showing up at events. No one questioned it, and he became part of their inner circle. Emily swallowed hard. So, they knew he had no memory of his past, and they just reinvented him. "Pretty much," Lila said. "The Carters are well connected. If they wanted to bury the details of his accident, they could have done it easily. But here's the thing. There's no record of them filing any official adoption paperwork. Legally, James Carter doesn't exist before 8 years ago." Emily closed her eyes, the weight of Lila's words sinking in. "They must have known who he was," she said softly. "They had to." "Probably," Lila agreed. "But proving it won't be easy. The Carters are powerful, and if they've been hiding this for 8 years, they'll do whatever it takes to keep it quiet." Emily's stomach churned. "I need to talk to them." "Emily," Lila said cautiously, "if you show up on their doorstep, they'll shut you down before you get a word in. You need a plan." Emily sighed, running a hand through her hair. "You're right. I'll figure something out." After hanging up, she sat in silence, her mind racing. She couldn't keep dancing around the truth. If the Carters knew who James really was, they had the answers she needed. But confronting them directly felt like walking into a lion's den. She needed another way in. Something subtle. Something they wouldn't see coming. The opportunity came sooner than she expected. That afternoon, while scrolling through social media, Emily stumbled upon a post from a Chicago charity organization. They were hosting a gala in 2 weeks, and the Carters were listed as honorary hosts. The event was black tie, exclusive and expensive, completely out of her league. But it was a chance to get close to them without raising suspicion. Emily picked up her phone and dialed Lila again. "I need a favor," she said as soon as Lila answered. "I need to get into the Carter Gala." Lila let out a low whistle. "You don't aim low, do you? Do you have any idea how hard it'll be to get you an invitation?" "I don't care," Emily said firmly. "This might be my only chance to talk to them. I'll do whatever it takes." Lila was quiet for a moment. "Okay," she said finally. "I'll make some calls, but you owe me dinner. No, a full weekend of drinks. When this is over." "Deal," Emily said, relief flooding through her. "Thank you, Lila." The next 2 weeks were a blur of preparation. Lila managed to secure Emily a ticket under the guise of a journalist covering the event. Emily rented a simple but elegant gown, knowing she needed to blend in without drawing too much attention. She practiced what she would say, rehearsing different scenarios in her head. Every night, she lay awake, picturing the Carters, imagining how they would react when she confronted them. Finally, the night of the gala arrived. Emily stood outside the grand ballroom of the Chicago hotel, her heart pounding as she took in the scene, the glittering chandeliers, the soft hum of classical music, the sea of finely dressed guests. It was a world far removed from her own. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. The Carters were easy to spot, their presence commanding the room. William, tall and silver-haired, had a politician's charm, while Diane, poised and elegant, exuded quiet authority. They moved through the crowd effortlessly, greeting guests with practiced ease. Emily stayed on the outskirts, watching them carefully. She needed the right moment, a chance to approach them without drawing attention. As she sipped her glass of water, she felt a tap on her shoulder. Turning, she came face to face with James. Her breath caught. He looked stunning in a tailored black tuxedo, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers. "Emily," he said, his voice warm but laced with surprise. "What are you doing here?" For a moment, she couldn't find her voice. Then, summoning every ounce of courage, she said, "I could ask you the same thing." James smiled faintly, though his confusion was evident. "The Carters invited me. They're like family to me." Emily's heart clenched at the word family. "I see," she said carefully. "It's quite the event." "It is," he agreed, studying her. "But I wasn't expecting to see you here." She hesitated, her pulse racing. "Maybe it's fate," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. "Or maybe it's time for some answers." The air in the ballroom felt heavier now, thick with unspoken tension. As James stared at Emily, his brow furrowed. His initial surprise at seeing her here had faded into something more guarded, almost wary. The elegant chatter of the other guests seemed to fade into the background as the two of them stood there. Caught in a moment neither of them fully understood. "Emily," he began, his voice low. "What is this about?" She hesitated, the words she had rehearsed in her head for days suddenly evaporating. How could she possibly explain her presence here without giving too much away? But before she could answer, the sound of laughter nearby drew James's attention. William and Diane Carter were approaching, their smiles radiant as they worked the room with their polished charm. "James, there you are," Diane said warmly, her gaze flickering briefly to Emily. "And who is this lovely young woman?" "This is Emily," James said, his tone careful. "We met in New York. She works at a jewelry store I visited." Diane's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, so brief that Emily might have missed it if she hadn't been watching closely. William's expression, however, remained composed as he extended a hand toward her. "A pleasure to meet you, Emily," he said smoothly. "How nice of you to join us tonight. Are you here on behalf of the charity?" "Yes," Emily replied, shaking his hand. She willed herself to stay calm, knowing she couldn't afford to tip her hand too soon. "I'm a journalist covering the event." "How wonderful," Diane said, her smile returning, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's always nice to see new faces supporting such a meaningful cause." The conversation moved on, but Emily could feel the weight of Diane's gaze lingering on her. She stayed quiet, letting James and the Carters talk about the gala, but her mind was racing. There was something in the way Diane had reacted to her name, something subtle yet undeniable. She knew more than she was letting on. After a few minutes, Diane excused herself to speak with another guest, and William followed, leaving Emily and James alone again. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "You're not really a journalist, are you?" Her stomach dropped. "What makes you say that?" "Because you don't strike me as someone who works galas for a living," he said, his tone matter of fact. "So why are you here, Emily, really?" She took a deep breath, knowing this was her moment. "James, I need to talk to you. Somewhere private." He frowned, glancing around the room. "What's going on? If there's something you need to say, just say it." "I can't, not here," she insisted, her voice firm. "Please, it's important." James hesitated, his suspicion clear, but eventually he nodded. "Fine, follow me." He led her out of the ballroom and down a quiet hallway. Away from the buzz of the gala, they stopped near a set of floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline, the lights twinkling like a sea of stars. James crossed his arms, leaning slightly against the glass. "All right, Emily, talk." Her heart pounded as she faced him. This was it. There was no turning back. "You told me you had an accident 8 years ago," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "That you lost your memory." "That's right," he said cautiously. "What about it?" She took a step closer, her gaze locked on his. "What if I told you I know who you were before the accident?" James's expression hardened, his posture stiffening. "What are you talking about?" "You weren't always James Carter," she said, her voice growing steadier with every word. "Before Chicago, before the Carters took you in, you were someone else, someone I knew, someone I loved." His eyes narrowed, and for a moment, there was silence between them. "Emily," he said slowly, "you're not making any sense." "Yes, I am," she insisted. "You were my husband, Michael, 8 years ago. You were in a car accident, and I was told you didn't survive, but you did. And somehow, you ended up here, living a new life as James Carter." He stared at her, his face a mix of confusion and disbelief. "That's not possible," he said, shaking his head. "I've never met you before New York. I would remember something like that." "No, you wouldn't," she said softly. "Not if you lost your memory. But I remember James. I remember everything. You were my husband. We had a son. We had a life together." His breathing grew heavier, and he turned away, running a hand through his hair. "This is insane. I don't know who you think I am, but I'm not." He stopped mid-sentence, his voice breaking. "What is it?" Emily asked, stepping closer. "What's wrong?" He didn't answer at first, his back still to her. When he finally turned around, his eyes were filled with something she couldn't quite place. Fear, doubt, and maybe even recognition. "I've been having these flashes," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Of places, people, feelings I can't explain. I thought they were just nothing, but now you're telling me they're real." "They are," she said, her voice trembling. "James, Michael, you're my husband. You're Ethan's father." His jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "If that's true," he said, his tone sharp, "then why didn't anyone tell me? Why did the Carters let me believe I was someone else?" "I don't know," Emily said, tears welling in her eyes. "But we can find out together." James didn't respond. He turned back toward the window, his shoulders tense as he stared out at the city below. Emily stood there, waiting, hoping, praying he would believe her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "If what you're saying is true," he said quietly, "then everything I've built, my entire life, has been a lie." James remained silent, his back to Emily as he stared out at the city skyline. The weight of her words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Emily could feel the tension radiating off him, and for a moment she wondered if she had pushed too far, too fast. But there was no turning back now. "James," she said softly, taking a cautious step closer, "I know this is overwhelming. I know it sounds impossible, but everything I've told you is the truth. You're Michael. You're my husband." He turned to face her, his expression a mixture of confusion and frustration. "If that's true, why didn't anyone come looking for me? Why didn't you come looking for me?" Her heart ached at the accusation in his voice, but she understood his anger. "I thought you were dead," she said, her voice cracking. "They told me you didn't survive the accident. I had no reason to believe otherwise." James ran a hand through his hair, pacing back and forth. "And the Carters? What about them? If I'm this Michael you're talking about, why didn't they tell me who I was?" "That's what we need to find out," Emily said. "I think they knew, James. I think they kept the truth from you." "Why?" he asked, his voice rising. "Why would they do that?" Emily shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "I don't know, but we're going to find out. Together." James stopped pacing, his gaze locking onto hers. For a moment she thought she saw a flicker of something familiar in his eyes. Recognition, maybe even trust. But before he could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. "James!" a sharp, clipped voice called out. They both turned to see Diane Carter approaching, her expression cool and composed. "There you are. We've been looking for you." Her gaze shifted to Emily, and her smile tightened. "And you must be the journalist James mentioned, Emily, was it?" "Yes," Emily said, her voice steady despite the nerves coursing through her. Diane's presence was intimidating, her polished exterior hiding something far more calculating underneath. Emily could feel it. Diane turned her attention back to James. "Darling, we should get back to the gala. William is about to make his speech, and we need you by his side." James hesitated, his jaw tightening. "I'll be there in a minute." Diane's eyes flickered briefly to Emily, and her smile grew colder. "Of course, take your time." She turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Emily waited until she was out of earshot before speaking. "She knows," Emily said quietly. "She knows who you really are." James frowned. You don't know that. Yes, I do, Emily insisted. I saw the way she looked at me, James. She's hiding something. James let out a heavy sigh, rubbing the back of his neck. I need time to process this, he said. I can't just accept this overnight. I understand, Emily said, her voice soft. But don't let them manipulate you. Don't let them keep you in the dark. He nodded slowly, though his expression remained conflicted. I'll talk to Diane. I'll ask her directly. Emily's stomach churned at the thought, but she knew it was the only way forward. Just be careful, she said. If they've been hiding this for 8 years, they won't give up the truth easily. James gave her a faint, almost reluctant smile. I'll be careful, thank you, Emily. As he walked away, Emily felt a mixture of hope and dread. She had taken the first step, but she knew the road ahead would be anything but easy. Back in the ballroom, Diane found William near the bar, nursing a glass of scotch. She leaned in close, her voice low. We have a problem. What kind of problem? William asked, his tone calm but laced with irritation. Her name is Emily, Diane said, glancing over her shoulder to ensure no one was listening. She's claiming James is someone else, someone from her past. William frowned, his grip tightening around his glass. Does she have proof? Not yet, Diane admitted, but she's planting doubts in his mind. He's starting to question everything. William took a long sip of his drink, his expression hardening. We've worked too hard to let this fall apart now. If James starts digging into the past, it'll ruin everything. Diane nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. What do you suggest? We need to shut this down, William said firmly. Find out everything you can about this Emily if she has any skeletons in her closet. We'll use them to discredit her. And if she doesn't, Diane asked, raising an eyebrow, then we'll make sure she stays out of the picture, William said coldly, one way or another. Later that night, Emily sat in her hotel room, staring out the window at the glittering Chicago skyline. Her mind was racing. Replaying every word James had said, she had gotten through to him. She was sure of it. But the Carters were a formidable force, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they wouldn't let James go without a fight. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, and she picked it up, her heart skipping a beat when she saw Lila's name on the screen. Hey, Emily said, trying to keep her voice steady. I've got something, Lila said, her tone urgent. It's not much, but it's a start. I found some old financial records that link the Carters to St. Andrew's Hospital. They paid for James's medical expenses just like we thought. Emily's grip tightened on the phone. What else? There's a transfer record, Lila continued. From St. Andrew's to Crestwood Recovery Center. It's signed by Diane Carter. Emily's heart sank. So, they've been involved from the beginning. Looks like it, Lila said. Be careful, Emily. The Carters don't strike me as the kind of people who play fair. Emily nodded, even though Lila couldn't see her. I will. Thanks, Lila. As she hung up, Emily felt a renewed sense of determination. The Carters might have all the power and resources in the world, but she wasn't going to back down. Michael, her Michael, deserved the truth, and she was going to make sure he got it. No matter what it took, the gala had ended, but the night's events left a lingering heaviness in the air. Emily sat in her hotel room, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her mind raced with thoughts of James, the Carters, and the secrets she was determined to uncover. Diane's cold smile haunted her, the way it had faltered when James introduced her. It was subtle, but Emily had caught it. Diane Carter was hiding something, and Emily knew she was getting closer to the truth. The sound of her phone buzzing snapped her out of her thoughts. She grabbed it and saw James's name on the screen. Her heart skipped a beat as she answered. James, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. I need to see you, he said, his tone serious. Can you meet me tomorrow morning? There's something we need to talk about. Emily's pulse quickened. Of course, where? I'll text you the address, he said. It's a park near my place. I want to keep this private. I'll be there, she replied without hesitation. After hanging up, Emily sat back, her mind spinning. What did James want to talk about? Had he confronted Diane? Had she told him the truth? She spent the rest of the night preparing herself for whatever might come, though the weight of uncertainty made sleep impossible. The next morning, Emily arrived at the park James had mentioned. It was quiet and serene, with tall trees lining the paths and the soft sound of birdsong in the air. She spotted James sitting on a bench near a small pond, his shoulders tense as he stared at the water. He looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable. "Thanks for coming." "Of course," she said, sitting beside him. "What's going on?" James took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair. "I talked to Diane last night," he said, his voice low. "I asked her about what you told me, about my past." Emily's heart pounded. "What did she say?" "She denied everything," James said, frustration evident in his tone. "She told me you're lying, that you're trying to manipulate me for some reason." Emily clenched her fists, anger bubbling inside her. "And you believe her?" James hesitated, his gaze dropping to the ground. "I don't know what to believe. Diane and William have been like family to me. They've done so much for me. But after what you told me, I can't stop thinking about it." "That's because it's the truth, James," Emily said, leaning closer to him. "You have to trust me. They're hiding something from you." James nodded slowly. "I feel it too. I've felt it for a while. Like there's something they're not telling me. But I don't know how to get to the bottom of it." Emily reached into her bag and pulled out a folder Lila had sent her. "This might help," she said, handing it to him. James opened the folder and scanned the contents: financial records, hospital transfer documents, and photos of the Carters at events shortly after his accident. His jaw tightened as he flipped through the pages. "They paid for my medical bills," he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "They arranged my transfer to Chicago. They've controlled your entire life since the accident," Emily said gently. "They've kept you in the dark about who you really are." James closed the folder, his hands trembling. "Why would they do this? Why would they lie to me?" Emily hesitated. "I don't know, but we can find out together." James looked at her, his blue eyes filled with a mix of anger and determination. "I want to know the truth. I need to know who I really am." Emily placed a hand on his arm, giving him a reassuring squeeze. "We'll figure it out. I promise." Meanwhile, back at the Carters' estate, Diane stood in the study, staring out the window with a glass of wine in hand. William sat behind the desk, going through a stack of papers. "She's getting to him," Diane said, her tone sharp. "He's starting to believe her." William didn't look up. "Then we need to act quickly. We can't let this spiral out of control," Diane continued. "If he remembers who he is, if he remembers everything, we'll lose him, and everything we've worked for." William set the papers down, his expression cold. "We won't let that happen. I've already taken steps to ensure she doesn't interfere anymore." Diane turned to him, her brows furrowing. "What do you mean?" "I've hired someone to deal with her," William said matter-of-factly. "She's too much of a liability." Diane's eyes widened. "William, are you insane? If something happens to her, nothing will happen to her." William interrupted, his tone calm but firm. "She'll just be encouraged to leave." Diane didn't look convinced, but she didn't argue. She turned back to the window, her grip tightening on the wine glass. "She's persistent. She won't back down easily. Then we'll make sure she has no choice," William said, his voice cold and final. That evening, as Emily walked back to her hotel after meeting with James, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced over her shoulder, but the sidewalk behind her was empty. Still, the uneasy feeling persisted, making her quicken her pace when she reached her room. She locked the door and drew the curtains, her heart racing. She tried to tell herself it was just paranoia, but deep down, she knew better. The Carters wouldn't let her get this close without trying to stop her. Her phone buzzed, and she saw a message from James. "We'll figure this out. Thank you for believing in me." Emily smiled faintly, her resolve strengthening. She wasn't going to let the Carters intimidate her. She had come too far, and James deserved to know the truth about his past. No matter what obstacles lay ahead, she was determined to see this through to the end. Emily couldn't shake the uneasiness that had crept over her since leaving the park. Every glance over her shoulder, every shadow in her peripheral vision, felt like a warning. The Carters were watching her. She was certain of it now. Yet, despite the fear crawling up her spine, she felt an even greater determination. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for James, and for the truth. The next morning, Emily received a text from James. "I need to see you. Can you meet me at my apartment? I want to talk without interruptions." Her chest tightened. She wasn't sure if meeting him at his place was a good idea, especially with the Carters so firmly rooted in his life. But this could be an opportunity to piece more of the puzzle together. "Of course," she replied. "Send me the address." An hour later, Emily arrived at the upscale apartment building in downtown Chicago. The doorman greeted her politely and directed her to the elevator. She couldn't help but feel out of place in the sleek, modern lobby with its polished floors and towering glass walls. This was James's life now, a life she had never been a part of. James opened the door to his apartment as soon as she knocked. "Thanks for coming," he said, his expression tense but welcoming. He gestured for her to step inside. The apartment was immaculate, with minimalist decor and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city. Emily noticed the lack of personal touches. No family photos, no memorabilia. It was a stark reminder of how much of James's life had been curated by the Carters. "This is nice," Emily said, trying to ease the tension as she glanced around. James let out a dry laugh. "It's fine. It doesn't feel like home. Though, I guess that's part of the problem." Emily turned to him, her heart aching at the vulnerability in his voice. "It's because it isn't your home. Your real home was with me, with Ethan." He looked away, his jaw tightening. "That's what I'm trying to figure out. I've spent 8 years building a life here, and now, I don't know what to believe anymore." Emily stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. "Believe what you feel. Trust your instincts, James. You said you've been having flashes, memories. Let them guide you." James met her gaze, and for a moment, she thought he might say something. But before he could, his phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at the screen and frowned. "It's Diane," he said, his voice laced with irritation. "She's been calling me non-stop since last night." Emily tensed. "Are you going to answer?" "No," he said, silencing the phone. "Not until I figure out what's really going on." Emily exhaled, relieved. "Good. We need to stay ahead of them." James nodded, but his expression remained conflicted. "I need answers, Emily, and I think I know where to start." She tilted her head, curious. "Where?" "The Carters' estate," he said. "There's a room in their house, a study. It's where William keeps all his files. He's meticulous about records. If they're hiding something, it'll be there." Emily's stomach churned at the thought. How do we get in without them knowing? James hesitated, his brow furrowed. "There's a gala at their house tomorrow night. It's a smaller event, mostly close friends and business associates. They'll be distracted." "You want to break into their study during the gala?" Emily asked, her voice a mix of disbelief and admiration. "Do you have a better idea?" James countered, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. She couldn't help but smile back. "No, but it's risky." "I know," he said. His expression turning serious. "That's why I need your help." Emily nodded, her resolve hardening. "I'm in." The following evening, Emily found herself standing outside the Carters' grand estate, her heart pounding as she adjusted the hem of her simple black dress. She had managed to secure an invitation through James, who had insisted that she pose as his guest. As they walked up the marble steps together, Emily glanced at him, her pulse quickening. For the first time since all this began, they felt like a team. Inside, the estate was every bit as lavish as she had imagined. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, and the hum of polite conversation filled the air. Diane and William stood near the entrance, greeting guests with their signature charm. Emily forced herself to smile as they approached. "James?" Diane said warmly, though her eyes darted briefly to Emily. "And Emily, how lovely to see you again." "Thank you for having me," Emily said, keeping her tone polite but neutral. Diane's smile didn't waver, but there was a flicker of something cold in her gaze. "Enjoy the evening," she said, before turning her attention to the next guest. Once they were out of earshot, Emily whispered to James, "She knows something's up. She's always like that." James replied quietly, "It doesn't matter. Let's stick to the plan." As the night progressed, James and Emily blended into the crowd, making small talk and sipping champagne to avoid drawing attention. When the moment finally came, James nodded subtly toward the hallway leading to the study. Emily followed him, her heart pounding with every step. The study was just as James had described, elegant and meticulously organized. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books and binders, while a large oak desk sat in the center of the room. "We don't have much time," James said, moving quickly to the desk. "Help me look for anything about the accident or my transfer to Chicago." Emily began scanning the shelves, her fingers trembling as she flipped through folders. After several tense minutes, she found a file labeled Medical Records. She opened it, her breath catching as she saw a document from St. Andrew's Hospital. "James," she whispered, holding up the file. "I think this is it." He took the file from her, his eyes widening as he scanned the pages. "It's all here," he said, his voice filled with both anger and disbelief. The accident, the transfer, the payments. They knew everything. Before Emily could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. They froze, exchanging panicked glances. "Someone's coming," James whispered. Emily's heart raced as they scrambled to hide the file. They barely had time to slip into the shadows when the door opened, and Diane stepped inside. The tension in the study was suffocating as Emily and James pressed themselves into the shadows of a tall bookshelf. Diane Carter stepped inside, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. She carried a glass of wine in one hand, her polished demeanor unchanged, though her sharp eyes scanned the room with suspicion. Emily held her breath, every muscle in her body taut as Diane moved further inside. Diane stopped near the desk, her gaze flickering to the papers James had hastily shoved aside. For a brief moment, Emily thought they might have gone unnoticed, but Diane's fingers brushed the edge of the folder they had been searching through. She lifted it, her expression unreadable as she flipped through the pages. "James," Diane said suddenly, her voice calm but commanding. "I know you're in here. Why don't you come out so we can talk?" Emily's heart raced, and she looked at James, silently pleading with him not to move, but James's jaw was clenched, his eyes locked on Diane. After a moment, he stepped out from the shadows, his posture stiff. "I'm here," he said, his voice steady despite the tension crackling in the air. Diane turned to face him, her lips curving into a tight smile. "There you are. I was wondering when you'd start snooping around." Emily's pulse quickened. Diane wasn't surprised to see him. She had been expecting this. Emily stayed hidden, her instincts screaming at her to stay out of sight. She needed to see how this played out before revealing herself. James folded his arms, his expression cold. "You knew this day would come, didn't you?" Diane tilted her head, her smile unwavering. "I hoped it wouldn't. We've given you everything. James, a new life, a new identity, opportunities most people could only dream of. And this is how you repay us, by digging into the past." "That's exactly what I'm doing," James shot back. "Because I deserve to know the truth. I deserve to know who I was before all of this." Diane's eyes hardened, the warmth in her voice replaced by something icy. "And what will you do with that truth? Destroy everything we've built for you? Walk away from the life we saved you from? Do you even understand what we've done for you?" James took a step closer, his voice rising. "You didn't save me. You stole me. You lied to me about who I am. Do you know what that feels like? To not even know your own name." Diane's expression faltered for the briefest moment before she regained her composure. "We did what was necessary to protect you." "Protect me," James repeated, his tone incredulous. "From what? From my own family? From the life I had before?" "Yes," Diane said firmly. "Your past was dangerous, James. You were better off without it." James shook his head, his frustration boiling over. "You don't get to decide that for me. You don't get to rewrite my life because you think it's what's best for me." Before Diane could respond, the sound of William's voice echoed down the hallway. "Diane, are you in here?" Diane's expression darkened, and she set the folder back on the desk. "Not a word," she hissed at James before turning toward the door. Emily watched as Diane intercepted William just as he stepped into the doorway. "Everything's fine," she said smoothly, her tone light. "James and I were just having a little chat." William's sharp eyes flicked to James, his expression tightening. "What's going on?" "Nothing to worry about," Diane said, placing a hand on William's arm. "James is just feeling a bit nostalgic." William's gaze lingered on James, but he didn't press the issue. "The guests are asking about you," he said to Diane. We should get back to the party." "Of course," Diane replied, giving James a pointed look. "We'll continue this later." As Diane and William left, James exhaled deeply. His shoulders sagging, Emily stepped out from her hiding spot, her heart still pounding. "That was close," she whispered. James ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "She knows I'm onto her. She's trying to spin it, make me doubt myself." Emily placed a hand on his arm, grounding him. "You did the right thing, James. You stood your ground. That's what matters." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and pain. "She said she was protecting me. From what? What could possibly be so dangerous about my past that they had to erase it?" Emily hesitated, unsure of how much to say. "Maybe it's not about your past being dangerous. Maybe it's about what they stood to gain by keeping you in the dark." James nodded, his jaw tightening. "Whatever it is, I'm going to find out. They can't hide the truth forever." Emily squeezed his arm, her resolve matching his. "You're not alone in this. We'll figure it out together." That night, as Emily returned to her hotel room, the weight of the evening pressed down on her. Diane's cryptic words and the cold calculation in her demeanor confirmed everything Emily had suspected. The Carters were willing to do whatever it took to keep James in their control. But what scared her most was the question Diane had left unanswered. What were they protecting him from? Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, and she picked it up to see a message from Lila. "Found something you need to see. Call me ASAP." Emily's heart raced as she dialed Lila's number. Her friend answered on the first ring. "I've been digging into the Carters' finances," Lila said, skipping the pleasantries. "And I found a transfer from one of their accounts to a private investigator 8 years ago, right after James's accident." Emily frowned. "Why would they hire a PI?" "I don't know yet," Lila admitted. "But whatever it was, they paid a lot of money to keep it quiet. This isn't just about James's accident, Emily. There's more to this." Emily's stomach churned. "Can you find out what the investigator was working on?" "I'm trying," Lila said, "but it's going to take time. Just be careful, okay? The Carters don't mess around." Emily nodded, though Lila couldn't see her. "I will. Thanks, Lila." As she hung up, Emily stared out the window at the glittering city below. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, but the picture they formed was more terrifying than she had imagined. Whatever the Carters were hiding, it was big, and Emily was determined to uncover it. No matter the cost, Emily barely slept that night. Lila's revelation about the private investigator rattled her, confirming that the Carters' control over James's life went deeper than she had imagined. If they had gone to such lengths to bury the truth, then whatever they were hiding wasn't just about protecting James. It was about protecting themselves. By morning, Emily felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had come this far, and there was no turning back now. She needed more answers, and she needed them fast. After grabbing a quick breakfast, she called James. "I've been thinking about what Diane said last night," Emily began when he picked up. "We need to figure out what they're hiding, and I think I know where to start." James sighed on the other end. "Emily, I can't just waltz into their house again and start snooping around. They're already suspicious." "I know," she said, her voice firm, "but we're not going to do this alone. Lila found out they hired a private investigator right after your accident. Whatever they were looking into could be the key to all of this." There was a pause before James responded. "You're saying the Carters didn't just stumble across me by accident?" "Exactly," Emily said. "They knew something, and they didn't want anyone else to find out. If we can figure out what the investigator discovered, we might finally have the answers you need." James hesitated. "And how do you propose we do that?" "Leave that part to Lila," Emily said confidently. "She's already working on tracking down the investigator, but in the meantime, I need you to keep Diane and William distracted if they're watching us. We need to make them think we've backed off." James let out a humorless laugh. "Distracting them isn't the problem. Pretending I trust them after everything, that's the hard part." "You don't have to trust them," Emily said softly. "Just play along, for now." Later that day, Emily met Lila at a small cafe on the edge of town. Lila looked tired but determined, her laptop open and several files spread out on the table. "I think I found something," Lila said as Emily slid into the seat across from her. "The private investigator's name is Richard Hale. He's based in Chicago, and he's been in business for over 20 years. His firm specializes in high-profile cases, stuff people want to keep off the radar. Do you think he'll talk to us? Emily asked, her fingers tapping nervously against the edge of the table. Lila smirked. That depends on how persuasive we are. Lucky for you, I managed to book a meeting with him. It's not exactly legal to discuss a client's case without permission, but I may have implied we were. Former clients needing follow-up information. Emily couldn't help but smile. Remind me to never underestimate you. Lila winked. Always a good policy. That evening, Emily and Lila arrived at Richard Hale's office. A modest yet professional space tucked inside a quiet building downtown. The receptionist led them to a small meeting room where Hale was waiting. He was in his mid-50s, with a sharp gaze and an air of professionalism that immediately put Emily on edge. So, Hale began, gesturing for them to sit. What can I do for you? Emily glanced at Lila, who nodded subtly, signaling for her to take the lead. Emily leaned forward, her voice steady but firm. We're here about a case you worked on 8 years ago for Diane and William Carter. It involved a man who was in a car accident. Hale's eyes narrowed slightly, but he kept his expression neutral. I can't discuss client details, you know that. I understand, Emily said quickly. But this isn't just about a client. It's about someone's life. Someone who has a right to know the truth about their past. Hale leaned back in his chair, studying her. And what exactly do you think I can tell you? Emily took a deep breath. The man you investigated, James Carter, before his accident. His name was Michael. He's my husband. He's been living under a new identity for the past 8 years, and he doesn't remember his life before the accident. We believe the Carters have been keeping the truth from him, and you might have the information we need to prove it. Hale's gaze flickered, the first sign of emotion breaking through his professional facade. You're saying this man doesn't know who he really is? That's right, Emily said. And the Carters are responsible, please. If you know anything at all, it could change everything. Hale was silent for a moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. I can't give you the full details of the case, but what I can tell you is this. The Carters hired me to confirm that James had no surviving family or ties that could interfere with their guardianship. They wanted to ensure there was no one who could claim him or challenge their custody. Emily's stomach twisted. And did you find anything? Hale hesitated, his jaw tightening. I found records of a wife and child. I told the Carters about it, but they dismissed it. They said the wife had moved on and wouldn't want anything to do with him. Emily's breath hitched. They knew about me and Ethan. Hale nodded. They knew, but they were determined to erase his past. They said it was for his own good. Emily clenched her fists, anger bubbling inside her. It wasn't their decision to make. Hale looked at her, his expression softening slightly. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. I didn't know how far they were willing to go. Emily's voice was firm. Thank you for telling me. This changes everything. As they left the office, Emily felt a surge of both relief and fury. The Carters had known all along. They had stolen Michael's life, erased his family, and built a web of lies to keep him under their control. But now, Emily had the proof she needed. We've got them, Lila said as they walked to the car. They won't be able to talk their way out of this. Emily nodded, her resolve stronger than ever. It's time to confront them. They're not getting away with this. Emily barely spoke on the drive back to her hotel, her mind consumed by what Richard Hale had revealed. The Carters had known about her and Ethan all along. They had deliberately erased Michael's past, cutting him off from the life he'd built, the family he'd loved. It wasn't just deception, it was cruelty. But now, Emily had proof, and she was ready to confront them. Her phone buzzed in the cup holder, breaking her thoughts. It was James. She hesitated for a moment before answering. Emily, James's voice came through, tense and urgent. We need to talk. Can you come over? I was just about to call you, Emily said. I found out something big. I'll explain everything when I get there. Okay, he said, exhaling audibly. I'll be waiting. When Emily arrived at James's apartment, she found him pacing near the windows, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He turned when she walked in, his expression a mixture of frustration and confusion. What's going on? He asked, skipping any pleasantries. I need answers. Emily, Diane's been acting strange, and I overheard her talking to William about me. They're hiding something. Something big. They are, Emily confirmed, setting her bag on the counter and pulling out the folder Richard Hale had given her. And I have proof. James stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as she handed him the file. He opened it, scanning the documents inside as he read. His face darkened, his jaw tightening with every page. They knew about you, he said finally, his voice low. They knew about Ethan. Yes, Emily said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. They hired a private investigator to dig into your past. When they found out about us, they decided to erase everything, pretend we didn't exist. They wanted to keep you all to themselves. James slammed the folder shut, his hands trembling. Why would they do this? Why go to such lengths to hide the truth? Emily hesitated, unsure of how to frame her theory. I think they saw you as a blank slate, someone they could mold into whatever they needed. You were vulnerable, and they took advantage of that. James turned away, running a hand through his hair. So my entire life with them, it's all been a lie. It doesn't have to be, Emily said softly, stepping closer. You can take back control. You can choose the life you want. James looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and pain. And what about us, you and Ethan? Where do we fit into this? Emily's heart ached at the question. That's up to you, James. But you deserve to know the truth about who you are. About the life you had before all of this. We can figure out the rest together. He nodded slowly, his expression hardening with determination. I need to confront them tonight. Emily's stomach dropped. Are you sure that's a good idea? They're not just going to admit what they've done? I don't care, James said firmly. I can't keep living like this, Emily. I need answers, and I need them now. An hour later, Emily and James stood outside the Carters' sprawling estate. The grand house loomed before them, its lights casting a warm glow that felt at odds with the cold tension building between them. James's jaw was set. His shoulders squared as he marched up the steps and rang the doorbell. Diane answered, her polished smile faltering the moment she saw them. James, she said, her tone careful. Emily, what a surprise. We need to talk, James said, his voice clipped. Now, Diane hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. William is in his study. Let me... No, James interrupted. Both of you, together. Diane's eyes narrowed, but she stepped aside, allowing them to enter. Emily followed James into the grand foyer, her heart pounding. Diane disappeared down the hallway, returning moments later with William in tow. His expression was unreadable, but his sharp gaze flicked between James and Emily, sizing up the situation. What's this about? William asked, his tone measured. It's about the lies you've been feeding me for 8 years, James said, his voice steady but seething. It's about the life you stole from me. Diane's smile returned, brittle and cold. James, I don't know what you're talking about. Don't play dumb, James snapped, tossing the folder onto a nearby table. I know everything. About the private investigator, about Emily and Ethan, about how you erased my entire life and made me believe I was someone else. William and Diane exchanged a glance, their carefully crafted facade beginning to crack. William cleared his throat, his tone calm but firm. James, you've been through a lot. Maybe you're confused. I'm not confused, James said, cutting him off. I'm finally seeing the truth. You lied to me. You manipulated me. And for what? To control me? To turn me into your puppet. Diane stepped forward, her expression softening in what Emily could only assume was an attempt to placate him. James, we did what we thought was best for you. You were lost, broken. We gave you a second chance. You didn't give me anything, James spat. You took everything from me. My wife, my son, my entire identity. You had no right. Diane's eyes flashed with anger, but she quickly masked it. We saved you, she said through gritted teeth. You were a nobody, an amnesiac with no future. We gave you a life worth living. Emily couldn't stay silent any longer. You didn't save him. You used him. You saw an opportunity, and you exploited it. You didn't care about what was best for him. You cared about what was best for you. William's gaze turned icy as he looked at Emily. You have no idea what you're talking about. Don't I? Emily shot back, You hired a private investigator to dig into his past. You found out about me and Ethan, and instead of doing the right thing, you buried the truth. You wanted him all to yourselves, no matter who you hurt in the process. The room fell into a tense silence, the weight of the accusations hanging heavy in the air. James stepped forward, his voice low but filled with resolve. I trusted you. I thought you were my family, but you're nothing more than liars. Diane's mask finally slipped, her face twisting with fury. Fine, she said coldly. You want the truth? Yes. We knew who you were. Yes, we kept it from you, but we did it for your own good. Your past was a mess, full of pain and loss. We gave you a chance to escape all of that. And what gave you the right to make that decision for me? James demanded. Diane didn't answer. She simply stared at him, her lips pressed into a thin line. James shook his head, his voice breaking. You don't get to decide who I am, I do, and I'm done letting you control me. With that, he turned and walked out, leaving Diane and William standing in stunned silence. Emily followed, her heart pounding as they stepped into the cool night air. What now? She asked softly. James looked at her, his eyes filled with determination. Now, I take my life back. The drive back to Emily's hotel was silent. Save for the occasional hum of traffic, James gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. The confrontation with the Carters had left him shaken, but beneath the surface of his anger was something stronger. Resolve. He wasn't just a pawn in their game anymore for the first time in 8 years. He was taking control of his life. Emily sat beside him, stealing glances as the city lights streaked past the windows. She could sense the storm raging inside him, the weight of the betrayal he had just uncovered. She wanted to say something comforting, but she knew this wasn't the time for reassurances. James needed space to process everything. When they reached the hotel, James parked the car and cut the engine. For a moment, neither of them moved. The quiet was heavy, but Emily finally broke it. Do you want to come up? She asked softly. James hesitated, his hand still resting on the wheel. Yeah, he said after a moment. I think I need to. In the small, unassuming room, James paced restlessly while Emily sat on the edge of the bed, watching him. His movements were tense, his thoughts clearly racing. They lied to me about everything, he said, his voice tight. And I let them. You didn't let them, Emily interjected gently. They took advantage of you when you were vulnerable. That's not your fault. James stopped pacing, turning to face her. But I should have known. I should have questioned things earlier. 8 years, Emily. 8 years of my life, gone. Emily stood, crossing the room to stand in front of him. You can't change the past, James, but you can decide what happens next. He looked at her, his expression softening. What happens next? He echoed, almost to himself. Emily placed a hand on his arm. You're starting to remember things, aren't you? Those flashes you told me about. They're pieces of the life we had, maybe if you let yourself. Those memories will come back. James nodded, his jaw tightening. I want to remember. I need to remember for you. For Ethan. The mention of Ethan made Emily's heart ache. He's going to be so happy to see you, she said, her voice breaking slightly. He's always asked about you. I told him stories, showed him pictures. He never stopped believing you were with us in some way. James's expression softened further, guilt flickering in his eyes. I should have been there for him, for both of you. You didn't have a choice, Emily reminded him, but you do now. The next morning, James woke to the faint light of dawn filtering through the curtains. He had stayed in Emily's room, the weight of the past day leaving him too restless to be alone. Emily was already awake, sitting at the small desk with a cup of coffee in her hands. You're up early, James said, sitting up and rubbing his eyes. I couldn't sleep, she admitted, turning to face him. There's too much to think about. James swung his legs over the side of the bed, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. Me too, Emily hesitated, then said, There's something I've been thinking about. The Carters. They won't let this go. You saw how Diane reacted. They're not going to sit back and let you walk away. James's jaw tightened. Let them try. I'm done letting them control me. They're powerful, James, Emily said cautiously. And they've kept this secret for a reason. Whatever they're hiding, it's more than just erasing your past. It has to benefit them somehow. James nodded slowly. I need to figure out what that is. If they've been hiding something bigger. We need to expose it. Lila's still digging into their financial records, Emily said. She might find something we can use, but in the meantime, maybe you should think about meeting Ethan. James looked at her, his expression softening. You think he's ready for that? I think he's been ready for a long time, Emily said. And I think you are too. Later that day, James and Emily stood outside Ethan's school, waiting for him to finish class. Emily's nerves were on edge, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her bag. She glanced at James, who looked equally anxious. He's going to love you, she said, offering him a small, reassuring smile. I hope so, James said, his voice low. I don't even know what to say to him. You'll figure it out, Emily said. Just be yourself. The school bell rang, and soon the yard was filled with children streaming out of the building. Emily's heart leapt when she spotted Ethan, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his face lighting up when he saw her. Mom, he called, running toward her. Emily crouched down, pulling him into a hug. Hey, sweetheart, how was school? It was good, Ethan said, pulling back slightly. Who's that? He gestured to James, who stood a few feet away, his hands in his pockets and a tentative smile on his face. Emily glanced at James, her throat tightening. Ethan, this is someone I want you to meet. His name is James. Ethan's brow furrowed as he looked at James, then back at his mom. He looks like the guy in the pictures, the ones you showed me of Dad. James crouched down to Ethan's level, his voice soft. That's because I am your dad. Ethan's eyes widened, his small face a mixture of confusion and hope. You're my dad. I am, James said, his voice breaking slightly. And I've missed you so much. Ethan hesitated for a moment, then launched himself into James's arms, wrapping his small arms tightly around his neck. James held him close, his eyes squeezed shut as tears streamed down his face. Emily watched the scene, tears blurring her vision. For the first time in years, her family felt whole again. Later that evening, as the three of them sat around the small dining table in Emily's apartment, James couldn't stop watching Ethan. The boy's energy and curiosity reminded him of himself at that age, and with every passing moment, James felt more certain that this was where he belonged. We'll figure this out, Emily said, placing a hand over James's. No matter what the Carters throw at us, we'll face it together.